Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host. Each week here at Siliconsciousness, we talk about different issues that pertain to AI. And this week, we're going to look at one of the ones that's most important and most contentious, and that has to do with issues of copyright and ownership of information that's being used to train AI or is being used by AI. We're extremely fortunate to have with us joining for this discussion Matt Topic. He is a partner at Lovie & Lovie, leading the firm's media, FOIA, and intellectual property practices. He represents clients in intellectual property disputes, including copyright claims against OpenAI and Microsoft, earning recognition for him on Time's 2024 list of the 100 most influential people in AI. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's just dive into the middle of this thing. This is one of the more contentious areas, and it seems to me that a lot remains to be resolved with regard to the treatment of content that's being used to train AI or is being used by AI in formulating responses to questions or actions. What are your concerns right now if we don't make clearer statements to the ownership of the original content?
Happy to address that. Let me first give you the standard lawyerly disclaimer that I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not behalf of any of my clients here. I think the big concern is that, number one, this content is just being taken without asking for permission, without paying any compensation. And that's really contrary to the norms of copyright law. When you create things, you have a right under the copyright statute, derives from the U.S. Constitution, to control the copying and use of your materials. And you should not, in our view is you are not, required to allow AI companies to simply take your material to train their products on and make a bunch of money from.
And so, let's break that down a little bit, because although all of our listeners are deeply engaged in AI, they maybe not be deeply engaged in the nuances of copyright law. When AI trains, it consumes a lot of documents, but that doesn't necessarily mean it presents the results of those documents in its output. Is there still a copyright concern just from the fact that it is consuming it?
Yes. This is sort of a division between what we've been calling input side infringement and output side infringement. And so certainly if a product like ChatGPT regurgitates or largely regurgitates a copyright protected work in response to a user's question, I don't even think that the AI companies would dispute that that's an act of copyright infringement. What they do dispute, and what we don't agree with them on, obviously, is their right to use it in the first place for training. The Copyright Act protects you from unauthorized copying, full stop, unless the doctrine of fair use applies. We can talk about fair use. It's a squishy kind of test under copyright law that has a lot of history to it. But in the first instance, you can't take articles that you have not properly acquired and without the permission of the copyright owner and make copies of them for any purpose, really, unless this doctrine of fair use applies, which I'm happy to talk a bit about.
Go ahead, talk about it.
So here's an example that would kind of people who remember when VCRs first came out. Okay, there was a very big case in the Supreme Court about whether it was copyright infringement to record television shows onto a VCR tape and play them back to yourself in your home later. And that resulted in a lawsuit against the makers and sellers of VCRs and VCR tapes as allegedly contributing to infringement. And so that turned on a doctrine of fair use, and it looks at a variety of factors. But the most important factor is the harm to the market for the original product. And the Supreme Court basically felt like, well, if people are recording things off of TV for their own home use, they're just time shifting. There isn't really a market that's being interfered with. And that has really always been a central consideration in the analysis under fair use. And so here, we believe that there is a market to license content for training. And we know that because some publishers have been given licenses and been compensated by some AI companies to obtain their content for use in AI training and AI outputs. And so we think a court is unlikely to find that it's fair use to just take all this when there very well could be a thriving licensing market for it, but for the fact that it's just been taken without permission. So that is really what I think a lot of these cases are going to ultimately turn on, is this defense of fair use.
And of course, this content takes a lot of different forms and can be used in a variety of different kinds of ways. Let's start with the journalistic applications of it. I think you've talked about that it represents a kind of a threat to journalism. Could you go into that?
Well, we've already started to see this sort of, I hate to say fake news because that has become such a politicized term, but fake in the realist sense. This is, people who've made businesses out of just finding stuff off the internet and using AI to just kind of rewrite it and put it back into the world on their own, or just create things out of whole cloth using AI and presenting it to the world as news. And it's obviously not news. It hasn't been researched by professional journalists and put together in accordance with journalistic standards. But all these things end up competing for eyeballs and competing for clicks and competing for traffic. So there has been a bit of a proliferation of this kind of content on the internet already. So that's sort of one way in which I think the journalism industry is being harmed by AI. But the products themselves also will compete with journalism. If I can go to Gemini, or I can go to ChatGPT and I can ask it about what's in a news story, or I can ask it about a political issue or something that's in the news, and it delivers a rather detailed summary of my copyright protected work of journalism, then it's unlikely that people are going to access my article and either subscribe to my newspaper or view the ads on my website, in which I should be allowed to monetize my own content. So there's a huge concern that these AI products are going to create substitutes for the news content that is the very foundation for their creation in the first place. And eventually where that can lead is, well, then why am I even making news anymore, right? I mean, there's a lot of reasons that journalists become journalists and news organizations do what they do. But just from an economic perspective, if my stuff's just being taken and given away without my ability to monetize it, well, why would I continue to do that? And I hope the day will come when the AI companies really fully start to appreciate that reality.
Well, I think, that one of the distinctions here is between AI companies and companies that use AI, because as we go further and further into things, companies will use AI in increasing ways. And when I think of what you were just talking about, I think of the fact that if I Google something, as I did 15 minutes ago, I'm going to get an AI-based summary at the top of whatever my search is right now. And that AI-based summary, which could be about what's going on in Syria right now, which is what I was Googling, could come from any number of sources. I don't know what they are, but it may preclude my digging any deeper. I might say, oh, that's enough information. And if I trust their algorithm and sources, I'm like, okay, that's fine. That's the headline. That's the tidbit that I wanted right now. And one could easily see this. I mean, we live in a world in which a lot of information is boiled down to soundbite size because it fits into social media that much better. And so this could be seen as a benefit to the user, even though it ultimately undermines the business model of the news producer.
I mean, I think yes, there's always to the user if I can avoid I think that you're correct that often people just want to see a short bit of something. And what used to happen is you would be displayed a lot of links to sites and you might get a line or two. And maybe sometimes you wouldn't go any further, but sometimes you would. And the big difference is that when these summaries are not presenting, this is what the New York Times said, and here's a link to the New York Times website, versus just portraying it as their own without giving any credit to where the news is coming from and without any links, then you are really, by design, keeping people on the Google homepage instead of giving them a path to go to the sources of that information and see it there if they want to see it, which will absolutely hurt the creators of news content. Yes, would people sometimes prefer to do that? I mean, I'm sure they would. People also would prefer to view news content without paying for it, right? I mean, nobody likes paywalls except the people who need paywalls in order to sustain their business model. And so, it can't be as simple as, consumers want it and therefore consumers should have it, because the copyright holders, the ones who invested the time and money to create the content, have a say in how their content gets distributed.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing is that we don't know what the algorithm is. So the blender that all this stuff gets tossed into, the operations of the blender, are unknown to us. We don't know what it prioritizes or doesn't prioritize. Right?
And I think this is the part where I start to get nervous about AI. I don't know that the AI companies can answer that question either. It's sort of a feature of this technology is they haven't really programmed it to do things. They've sort of just allowed it to teach itself and do things itself. And so, I mean, that I think in part is why you see some of these very silly things that we see AI summaries presenting, like eating rocks or gluing cheese to pizza. I mean, I think it's the AI models, I think, still don't understand the difference between The Onion and something that is not parody, that's actually real news. And that's why you kind of see these things. And so I worry a lot also.
Well, there's less and less difference between The Onion and real news every day, but
It's a fair point.
Yeah. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, look, we AI, is the only technology I know that where it's commonly referred to, it has hallucinations.
Yeah.
And the idea that, there's a hallucination that could totally distort the meaning of something you did is a big deal. Now, of course, there's, there are other kinds of content that AI is training on. And we've had some cases come up, for example, with regard to writers or comedians who said, don't train on me, whether it's Sarah Silverman or Scarlett Johansson or the Writers Guild of America. Because, AI, at least as far as I've seen it, played around with ChatGPT and so forth, it has no hesitation to come back to you and say, tell me this story in the style of Robin Williams or something like that. And you're going to get back a story in that style. Sorry to digress, but I was watching yesterday Ben Affleck on some clip, and he said, well, AI, the last thing that it will go will be Hollywood writers and producers, because AI is just incapable of producing Shakespeare. And I thought, well, so are most Hollywood writers and producers. And that, that just good enough is plenty good enough for a lot of people when it comes to content, right? And so that becomes a threat to, people who could have their stuff thrown into the blender and then used for another purpose without them getting any benefit.
And to add on that, I think it's sort of a bad thing for society to accept lower and lower levels of quality and higher rates of inaccuracy. I mean, there's a lot of people using ChatGPT. There's a lot of people relying on the results that it's delivering, even though we know that its accuracy level is really not there yet. And just me personally, I'm not really sure what the use case is for me for a product that's correct 80% of the time that I have to double check, right? I mean, as a lawyer, lawyers have gotten themselves in trouble using it to, asking it for case citations, and it will just make them up with a high level of confidence, which is this sort of idea that I've seen it being described as like a BS machine. BS in a technical sense, meaning it's less than fully accurate, but it's being presented with a high level of confidence and indifference to the fact that it isn't completely accurate. And I think that's a pretty good kind of summary of where we are with it, and where I think a lot of the limitations are. But and that all can harm copyright owners. We also see instances in which it's hallucinating what news articles actually say. And so now I'm a publisher, and a product being used by 300 million people is saying that I wrote an article that says something that it doesn't say, and maybe in fact is completely the opposite of what it says. So all these things I think are bad for the news business, but I think they're ultimately bad for society too.
So there are a lot of solutions for this that are put out there. And of course, some of them are legal and regulatory, and some of them are technological. And so in the technological side, you hear about watermarking, or you hear about blockchain. You hear about ways to put a ownership signature inside digital content. Which of these do you consider to be promising?
Well, one of the issues we have in some of our cases is the removal of what's called copyright management information. So in the turn of the millennium, Congress passed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It prohibits the removal of copyright management information where there's reason to know that might conceal or facilitate copyright infringement. And so that's defined as things like author, title, copyright notice, terms of use information. And it appears very clearly that when the AI companies scraped all this content, they left all that out. And so that's why you see a lot of lack of attribution from where things come from, because it has literally been trained not to do that. So, I think, yes, there is a place for making sure we have a robust system for tracing the sources of information and giving proper attribution. But to some extent, the law is already there. It's just not being followed by companies that make a lot of money by not following it.
We're about to head into a new administration here in Washington. In fact, President-elect Trump yesterday named as his AI czar a guy named David Sachs, who is closely associated with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and a group of folks that are tied closely to Trump. The general message we have gotten from these guys is less regulation is better. Let's let the companies handle this. What do you expect going forward from this new administration with regard to these issues?
Well, the nominations seem to indicate which way it's going, right? Which is exactly what you pointed out. Less regulation, more pedal to the metal, raise as much capital as you can, just continue to develop these products as fast as you can. And in the context of private companies with private profit motivations, and I believe in capitalism. I'm not saying that people shouldn't make money. I think that's kind of how society moves forward, is ordering itself with caveats and protections sort of around that idea. So this is just where the technology is very different from something like, nuclear energy and the development of atomic weapons, right? That was being done by the U.S. government under the strictures of U.S. government control. And we wouldn't allow people to you can't just build a nuclear reactor, right? You've got to go through a whole regulatory process to do that. And why is that? Because it's a product or a system that has potentially very harmful impacts on all of society, the entire world, if not used properly. And we are also hearing with a straight face from people in the AI industry that they can't rule out the possibility that AI will take over and will decide to kill everyone. I mean, you have Sam Altman saying like, oh, that's probably what will eventually happen, but we'll have all these great companies in the meantime. I mean, the cavalier attitude with which people in this industry are talking about literally the extinction of humanity, it's just terrifying to me. And the idea that the regulation on this is going to come from people who are coming out of that industry and are motivated by letting that industry go pedal to the metal, full steam ahead, I think should scare everyone. I think that if there's a case to be made for why we need to have robust AI in order to compete with other world powers, well, then those are things that should be under the control of the U.S. government and not left to the sort of the vagaries of the private market.
Yeah, although, by the way, there's a flip side of that, which we've often talked about here, which is the U.S. government can say, we want to edge out our Chinese competitors on AI, and we have the best AI, so people will sign deals with us saying they won't work with them. But the reality is most of the world's happy with 80% good enough AI. They don't need the state of the art. They would just like to be in the game. And so there is a negative competitive consequence to that kind of positioning. Well, since you brought up the world, let's talk about the world. Is there a place that's doing this better right now?
I mean, in sort of true European form, you have the EU, taking a more sort of down in the weeds, sort of regulatory approach. That is not necessarily the way the United States typically does these things, but I think there is sort of a place for that. I think a big question from a legal perspective is who bears the liability for these things? If an AI product results in racial discrimination in hiring decisions or in public benefits decisions, for example, who's responsible for that? And I think in the first instance, we should think really hard about whether shouldn't it be the people who are making the products that are being relied on, shouldn't they have a duty to make sure that their products are resulting in appropriate legal outcomes. So in terms of what countries are doing better, I think everyone has sort of been caught off guard by just how quickly this has developed as far as it has developed. And so far it looks like Europe is kind of taking a similar approach like it does to privacy issues and data issues and things like that. I think in the US, I think we're pretty flat-footed on how we want to handle this. And it's in the meantime, the things are just charging ahead anyway. And we're sort of getting farther and farther behind them. So I don't know that fully answers your question, but I guess the answer is I don't know that anybody's really doing a great job in handling this.
Well, but one of the distinctions between EU philosophy with regard to technology regulation and U.S. philosophy with regard to technology regulation is they tend to say we side with the private citizen. They have to opt in to whatever application of their data or content the corporate world wants to make use of. Whereas in the US, we say we side with the big company, and they may want to, in the case of, internet data, they may want to use the data, and you have to opt out from that. And it seems to me that's a kind of a fundamental divide here. Shouldn't the creator of the content be able to say, I don't want anybody to use this content?
Yes. Absolutely. And I more than should they, I think under the law, they do have the right to do that. We don't say, I'll give you an example. So some of the AI companies are saying that they will comply with what we're calling exclusion protocols or the robot.txt protocol. There's a whole universe of bots that scrape the internet for different purposes all the time. And that's where AI companies are getting content. It's being scraped from websites, and some, including OpenAI, have said, well, if you implement these certain protocols, then our bots will not scrape your site. There's a lot of questions about whether they're actually honoring that, or whether there's sort of backdoor ways that they're doing it. But to me, that's like taking the position that if you don't lock the front door to your house, I get to come in and steal anything I want, because if you don't want me to take it, then you should just lock the door. And this is just the intellectual property equivalent to that. This is my copyright protected material. I have the right to control who gets to use it. And if you want to use it for AI training purposes, maybe I say, great, sure, you can use it. Here's what it will cost if you want to do that, right? Or maybe some news companies will say, I believe in this technology and I just want to contribute my content for the betterment of society because I believe that AI will make the world better. Maybe people will do that. I tend to think probably not. And I think there's a lot of suspicion about whether any of these companies are really trying to act in the best interest of the world or society versus their own private, interests and shareholder interest. But, ultimately the control over those decisions lie with the person who owns the copyright. And if the AI companies don't like that, then they can make their own content. They can invest all the money. They can hire a bunch of people to just write content that they can use to train the AI systems. Instead, they want to just freeload off of work that has already been done at great expense and great risk in many instances by professional journalists.
You optimistic that we're going to get a clearer delineation of what these rules are and some compliance with them over the course of the next couple of years? Or are you afraid this is a slippery slope, and given the regulatory environment here, we may not get our arms around it?
I think that the copyright cases are going to make their way through the federal court system, and within a few years, we are going to know the answer to these questions one way or the other. I mean, I obviously am rooting for one particular way that comes out, but I do think that this is sort of typical in the U.S. This is another sort of U.S. European sort of differences. We tend to have maybe more laws that are maybe a little more kind of open-ended, and we leave it to the courts to apply them in individual cases, and we settle things out more in that context than regulators sort of thinking ahead about everything that could happen and trying to design a very Byzantine system for how you would do that. So I think that, yes, I mean, I'm optimistic. I'm fairly certain that within a few years, the question of, are AI companies allowed to take copyright protected content and use it to create their products, we're going to have an answer to that question. And I'm honestly, as a lawyer, I'm just thrilled and honored to be a part of being able to do that.
Well, it's certainly a pivotal moment. And as this develops along the way, we'll try to get you back to talk about it as we make progress. But for now, I think this has been a great overview and discussion of an extremely important topic. For discussion of more topics like this, come back to Silicon Consciousness every week. Also, starting next month, join us for a new Silicon Consciousness series of podcasts focusing on the intersection of AI, energy, and climate. More on that in the weeks ahead. For now, thank you very much, Matt. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And we'll be back with you again here next week. Bye-bye.